You're listening to Working in Oncology, a podcast and video show that spotlights oncology practice staff and industry influencers who work behind the scenes to shape the future of oncology. The more knowledge the oncology community shares with each other, the more we all grow. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Working in Oncology. I'm your co-host, Alicia Evans. I'm joined today by Jeff Bockman, EVP and Oncology Practice Head at Cello Health BioConsulting. CHBC is a leading strategic consultancy helping biopharma inflect value with their early pre-POC programs. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alicia. Very honored to be here. Thanks.
I am excited about our conversation today. I think a lot of our listeners are curious about what goes on behind the scenes of oncology drug development. So why is there funding for this treatment of one diagnosis versus another? Who makes these decisions and why, right? I think you'll be able to shed some light on the subject.
I hope so.
Awesome. So before we jump into the show, can you tell our viewers a little bit more about you, your background, and what you do?
Sure. So I got to where I am through both hard work and serendipity. So, I started in academia, did the Ph.D. route and the postdoc route. And then after that, went to a startup biotech, working in cancer and infectious diseases. My background was originally in infectious diseases, and was with that startup biotech for a couple of years. I was one of the first scientists to join it. And in the course of that, got exposed to some of the financial and investment side of being an early stage biotech, engaging with some of the investors, et cetera. And then I left the biotech and started kind of consulting on my own, and ultimately consulted to the legacy company of where I'm at now, which is Defined Health, which was acquired and became Cello Health BioConsulting. So, but that kind of shift was a lot happenstance, right? It's not like I sat down and said, "Oh, I want to be a consultant." Didn't even know what it was. So it was really just a opportunism on my part, connecting with the right company, a great group of people, particularly the founder of Defined Health, who is now the executive chairman. And really enjoying the kind of mingling of scientific, clinical, and kind of commercial elements that we do every day, and all the multitasking, right? It's never a dull moment. So many different agents and companies with different questions and concerns that we're working with across all different tumor types in cancer, as well as the work we do outside of cancer. So,
wow, it's a pretty broad range of experience there.
Yeah, well, there are even other diversions and digressions along the way, but maybe we'll get to those later.
Got it. So in the world of therapy development, there are several different players in the process. Some names that we're familiar with, or some that we're not. Can you help go over who are the usual players? Who is making these decisions? Who's developing these therapies?
That's a big question. So first of all, I'd say is that the industry, the biopharma industry, is made up of a variety of key stakeholders, right? There are the pharma companies, obviously, who most people know about, right? The Mercks and the Pfizers and the Bristol Myers, et cetera, the Roche, Genentech. And then there is a whole group of what we'll call the innovators. Not to say that pharma aren't innovative, but much of the novel and new drugs that they are ultimately bringing to market are deriving from these biotechs. And it's the biotechs who are most of our clients, at least in oncology. And those biotechs obviously are funded by venture capital, by and large, although these days, increasingly also public money, because they readily go to the market and raise quite significant funds during this past year and a half. And then, of course, part of that ecosystem too are, the regulatory agencies and the different countries, et cetera. But if we think of it just more simply in terms of the funders, the VCs, the developers and ultimately the marketers, pharma, and then the innovators being the biotech. That's kind of the tripartite core of kind of where this all begins. And hopefully, and I think it's relatively true, much of what is being funded at early stage in these innovative companies is trying to address, high unmet need areas. That's not to say that every one of them, if they were to be approved, is going to change the treatment paradigm. Sometimes the important improvements can be smaller and incremental, but, mostly they are trying to look for, where there are significant unmet needs, where, either in large tumor types that everyone knows about, where there's still unmet needs like HER2 positive breast cancer, or much smaller niche type of tumor types where, maybe less attention has been paid, in part maybe because they're very challenging spaces to work in, like glioblastoma, or even some of the rare sarcomas, et cetera.
Got it. So when we look at a typical therapy, can you help us track kind of the development process? So maybe a popular medication or therapy like a Keytruda or something. Can you help us track how it got developed and how it came to market?
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, at a high level, yes. I think one of the more interesting things about Keytruda is the fact that in many ways that was serendipitous, in the sense that that was a program going on, I think, within Organon that was acquired by Schering-Plough. Didn't have much attention to Schering-Plough that I'm aware of, and I don't want to misspeak, but as far as I don't think it was a high profile program at the time.
And that's a startup, is that?
Well, no, Schering-Plough was another large pharma company, and then Schering-Plough was acquired by Merck, right? Because there's a lot of M&A amongst large pharma, right? Mm-hmm. Merck acquired Schering-Plough, Pfizer acquired Parke-Davis, Warner-Lambert. So, a lot of that inter-large pharma M&A is very common. So, Merck ends up with this Schering-Plough / Organon program, bumping around internally that, I'm sure had some strong champions, but, at that time, one has to remember that the idea of immunotherapy of cancer, or as it's also called now, kind of immuno-oncology, or as I call for short, IO therapies for immuno-oncology, they were not the hot topic they are now. In fact, back in the mid 2000s, and certainly before that, they were pretty much verboten in many ways, because there had been so many failures. The field of the people who were researching at that point were, called tumor biologists, tumor immunologists that were kind of doing this. And the main programs that had been brought forward back then were mostly cancer vaccines, which were kind of developed with the framework similar to the idea of developing, infectious disease vaccines, which are, really used to prevent infection. Very different, this idea of trying to treat an active cancer, for all sorts of reasons that, maybe we can go into later, or if anyone wants to discuss offline, we can. And so there were a lot of failures in this cancer vaccine space, because that was mostly what was defining kind of immunotherapy then. Now, there were a few approvals and successes. One of them even was Schering-Plough, in terms of interferon, IL-2, that was developed and, ultimately kind of really brought forward by Chiron, which then was acquired by Novartis. And, these had some glimmers of very interesting activity, particularly in like melanoma or renal cell carcinoma, kidney cancer. But they were highly toxic, not very well tolerated. Only a small percentage of patients responded, and an even smaller percentage responded really well. So you had a field for a long time that, was defined by those few agents: interferon, IL-2, BCG for bladder cancer, and then just all these failures, mostly in cancer vaccines. So it wasn't until really like 2010, 2011, when suddenly the world changed, right? You had BMS's Opdivo, nivolumab approved. You had Merck's Keytruda, pembrolizumab approved. You also had Dendrion's cancer vaccine, Provenge, approved. Bit of a niche player, but it's still, generating revenue. You had Yervoy, also from BMS, ipilimumab, approved. So now all of a sudden you had these, what are mostly antibodies to what are, PD-1, PD-L1, the checkpoint inhibitors. These are key proteins expressed, on the T cell and or tumor that are basically responsible for silencing the immune system, right? So essentially what the cancer does is it creates a permissive environment for itself, creates this immunosuppressive environment that blocks the body's kind of normal ability and desire to reject things that are wrong, whether that's, a tumor or an invading, bacteria or virus. And these antibodies basically unblock that blockage and allow the immune system to see the tumor. And although they don't work in all cancers and they don't work in all patients in all cancers, and some tumors they work much better, like melanoma and RCC and lung cancer, than others where they really have minimal activity, like prostate cancer. They have created a massive sea change or a paradigm shift in how we think about treating cancer. So, what Merck, BMS, and all the others have done is what kind of pharma generally does, is they invest a huge amount after after first approvals in life cycle management. So Merck has done an amazing job. They have, I don't know, 1,000 plus, probably more, ongoing clinical trials with Keytruda alone, mostly in combination with chemo, in combination with radiotherapy, combination with small molecule kinase inhibitors, and in combination with other novel IO agents, including other IO antibodies. So a lot of the news coming out of ASCO, for example, over the weekend and through the early part of this week, will about other new targets besides PD-1 and PD-L1, like LAG-3 or TIGIT, et cetera. These are kind of the next generation of immuno-oncology targets. So that's sounds like a long story, but that's only a little teeny peek into the kind of the what it took to ultimately kind of bring that program forward. It took scientists who are true believers in kind of the value of the immune system in fighting cancer. It took the discovery of these particular targets. It was certainly lucky that some of these first targets proved to be as effective as they were, because some of the other ones haven't been. So Jim Allison got the Nobel Prize. A little bit of kismet there, but yeah, certainly kismet. But so Jim Allison got the Nobel Prize for this, but many others contributed to kind of exploring that they're called checkpoint inhibitors, this checkpoint pathways. And now they're kind of the foundational cornerstone of treatment, either in a particular line or in multiple lines across many, many different cancers, with, as I said, a huge amount of continued development in other tumor types, other lines of therapy, other combinations going on right now. There are at least 6, I think, approved checkpoints now. Merck is the biggest one, followed by BMS's, and then you've got Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and Roche Genentech, Regeneron, a few others, also that are out there. But it's competitive. But the behemoth in the room is Merck's Keytruda.
Yeah, that's one that most of us are familiar with. Yeah. And it sounds like there are continuing innovations in just in Keytruda.
It's just in Keytruda, but the latest. So there is a organization called Cancer Research Institute, CRI, which was actually founded by, I believe it was the daughter of Coley. Dr. Coley, here at what ultimately became Memorial Sloan Kettering, was considered to be really the, I don't know what you would call him, great-grandfather of immunotherapy, because he was treating patients with what was called Coley's toxin. So that, but it was never, and it was actually used up through the 60s. It was never formally approved. But in any event, CRI, has funded a lot of the key research as a not-for-profit foundation in immuno-oncology. And they also do a lot of tracking. And I think from their recent numbers, if I recall correctly, there are probably 3,000 trials going on with,
Wow.
all the different checkpoint inhibitors that there are. So Keytruda, Opdivo, Libtayo, Bavencio, who am I missing? Anyway, so all the players, but by far the largest amount of clinical trial activity is with Merck's Keytruda.
Understandable. So when we have so many different avenues, how do we decide, or do the usual players, I guess, decide which therapy to pursue? How do they make it? Is it just a question of follow the money? Of course, without the money, nothing can happen.
Yeah.
But what other factors do they consider?
So many factors kind of going in to try to figure out what to bring forward, and the kind of the questions and the degree that these are explored and how deep and broad certainly varies between whether that question is being asked internally within a large pharma company or whether it's being asked by a biotech company.
Okay.
So let's start with the biotech company, since that's where a lot of the innovation, again, not all of it, but a lot of the innovation begins, right? That's where a lot of the innovation in, adoptive cell therapy has been, which is a burgeoning area. And there are, a number of approvals already, where gene therapy began by and large, and there are a number of approvals there, for, rare monogenic disorders. So the biotechs are kind of seen as the warehouse of innovation, if you will, and increasingly a large component of the pipeline, as it's called, the drug development pipeline of large pharma, is deriving from, external to the pharma itself. So not from pharma's own internal research. I think it obviously varies by company, but in some companies it's 50%, maybe even 75% of their pipeline is coming from external deals, either licensing a program from a biotech or outright acquiring the biotech, right? Like Amgen recently acquired, a company called 5 Prime to get some of their antibodies and other programs. So when a biotech is trying to think about kind of what to develop, part of that question depends on kind of what their raison d'etre, what do they have? If they're a discovery company, a platform company, right? Maybe they've got some novel, interesting way to generate antibodies, of which there are many. You've got to decide, all right, you can generate these antibodies. They may do some cool things that others can't, but how do you decide what to target? Right? There are lots of targets. So that's one of the first gating things, right? Because while the VCs like to fund innovation, you don't want to be all about risk after risk after risk piled on top of each other. So very often you will see biotechs, in order to prove their platform, but also to take some risk out of it, going after well-established targets, many of which may already be approved, right? Like HER2. The amount of drug development around HER2, despite the fact you've got Herceptin, you've got Perjeta, you've got Kadcyla, you've got Enhertu, you've got a number of multiple, and they're mostly biologics, but they're also small molecules approved in the space. And yet there's still unmet need, particularly for advanced stage breast cancer patients. So, if you map where much of the activity is across all of the biopharma industry against targets, I think HER2 is at the lead, and then EGFR, which they're also approved drugs. And so, you do see a lot of attempts to de-risk by going after these. And while it's kind of easy to say, oh, we've got too many, we don't need any more, that's just a Me Too type agent. It's not going to be differentiated. In some cases, these can be differentiated and provide significant clinical value to patients. So that's kind of one of the first things that happens, particularly with really risky platforms. So an antibody is one platform. It's pretty well established. Most of those companies, yes, they may go after HER2, but they're also going after other novel targets. some of which have been more recently validated because there have been recent approvals like TROP2, which there have been a recent ADC approval, antibody drug conjugate approval for. The more risky the platform, the more likely they are to go after these well-validated targets. Like there are a lot of adoptive cell therapy companies, and mostly their lead programs are going after CD19, which is approved for other cell therapies, in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, in acute lymphocytic leukemia, et cetera, because everyone and the investors are very kind of scared of, we're going to take a brand new, novel, unvalidated target, take a brand new, unvalidated approach, and put the two together and just double, magnify our risk. So that's the first consideration, is the target. And then, of course, is where do you develop it, right? Which indications do you develop in? And that thinking, generally has to start even before you start getting early signals in early clinical trials, which, of course, is going to more definitively tell you where to go, because you need to at least be thinking about where you might end up in advance of doing it. You can't just kind of wait around and then just be reactive. And then you're just scrambling, right? So, and that's where we spend a lot of time with our clients. These are early stage, as you said, helping them inflect value with pre-POC assets. So helping them say, I've got a novel platform. Should you go after CD19 or BCMA or HER2 or EGF, or should you go after something more unvalidated? And then once having decided on the target, or they may already have the target, which indications are best? If you're going after HER2, sure, you can go after, a number of different late line therapies in breast cancer, but HER2 is expressed in other tumor types like gastric and even small percentages in other tumor types. So maybe the better thing to do is go for a niche approval and a percentage, a molecularly defined subset of other tumor types that express, where a subset of patients express HER2. So those are all the questions that are kind of going on internally, as well as, how much money do we have? What's our burn rate in order to prosecute that clinical trial development? What do we want to be when we grow up? Do we want to bring that drug all the way through to mid-stage phase 2 development, or do we want to license it out, or we hope to get acquired, early on? So, so there's true science and biology, the target being asked about. There's clinical development questions being asked. And there's kind of strategic, like, what's the trajectory for the company, all wrapped into the financial considerations of how much money do we have? How much could we raise, et cetera.
So it sounds like it's a balance. It has to be of all those different factors.
Absolutely. It's a very delicate balance with a good, healthy dose of luck. Obviously, having, experience is important. And that's one thing biotechs have nowadays increasingly that they didn't have, as much of, even frankly, 10 or 15 years ago, was, a much more mature, seasoned group of people leading the company, right? These are people either out of pharma or who have been in one or multiple other biotechs. So they kind of know what's involved, because, it's one thing to choose these things, to choose the target, to choose the indication, to validate your platform, to start clinical development. But there are a lot of complexities around CMC manufacturing for some of these agents. There's regulatory complexities, not just for US, but differences between EU or, Asia, et cetera. So a lot of different skill sets, are required ultimately to kind of bring these programs forward far enough and then ultimately, to market.
Yeah. And so we talked about biotech. What about some of the other players? Is their thought process similar?
The process is similar. It's obviously different. If you're a large pharma, not to say you're not concerned about money, because you don't have infinite cash.
They have a bit more padding.
They have a lot of money on hand. They invest a lot amount into R&D as a percentage of their revenue. So they ask many of these questions. They ask them more deeply. They spend more time analyzing them. They even go outside, right? I mean, as big as these companies are, they often go outside for help doing things, everything from patient research to just kind of more kind of classic kind of market research to, the big strategic questions that they need help on, and so on. So that's why it's just massive ecosystem of all these different players that are involved.
So something we haven't really talked about is academia and how those efforts play into the pipeline.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, because this is an interesting and maybe even a little bit sticking point, because many of the, so I said that the innovation engine by and large is biotech. They're generally not inventing it out of nowhere, right? Generally, biotech is coming out of academia. Where's that research for those platforms or those novel targets, et cetera, coming from? All of us, the taxpayers, NIH funding, which is why it's so important to fund NIH. But also at the same time, people question, well, but NIH is funding all this. What are we getting? What are we getting back now? When you ask that question, it depends what time frame and how you answer it, right? Ultimately, we are getting back because we're getting these important drugs, but there are a lot of intermediaries along the way. So without getting into policy or other things like that.
Between our tax dollars and the co-insurance.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, it is within academia that the real engine of innovation. Now that gets taken within the biotech and it gets kicked up significantly and it gets formalized in order to, enable it to be productive, to be credible, to ultimately get approval, right? Because, most academic labs, even though increasingly they are kind of starting to develop some drugs and bring them to, at least through preclinical, they're not necessarily set up, and don't have the expertise, once you're kind of into early clinicals, although some are doing that certainly, and that's where the biotech and then the pharma companies come into play. But many of these biotechs are founded, by either the entrepreneur scientists themselves, or they're founded by, a VC or early stage VC, of which there are a number that just go out and scout and say, oh, our team has found this really interesting, cool mechanism or target or new platform at this university, and that could be, anywhere in the world, frankly, and, decides to build a company around it. That's kind of generally how it goes.
So if I understand correctly, it sounds like the foundations are usually often set by academia.
The foundational research is often coming out of academia, and not always, but often. And
then generally goes to the biotech, and then to pharma.
No, certainly, there are biotechs that are already established that will license programs or IP or technologies from academia, right? So they've already started with something and they're either acquiring additional pieces or maybe something orthogonal. And pharma also does increasingly look early stage, and there are even groups within large pharma for doing kind of early stage investments. And most pharma have their own corporate VC, groups that are also making investments, either investing in the lab in some type of early collaboration, or investing or helping form a new co-investing along with more traditional, VCs, et cetera. So, what I'm talking about is just is
it's
a distillation.
Whole network.
Yes, and there are many, many layers and many more nuances and complexities to this.
So often in practice, the idea comes, why is there a treatment for one diagnosis versus another? And I know we talked about reasons why, therapy, but can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, it's a really complicated question. Part of it's tied to what I already said about risk, right? So, some of those, if you're choosing to take out some risk by going after a validated target, mostly that's going to take you to more validated indications, which also by definition are also going to be more competitive, like breast cancer. The other side of taking risk out is not going into places where there is huge risk. So, there are tumor types, and I'm not even talking about small niche tumor types, right? Because there are tumor types where only 100 people have them, or 1,000, right? There's not even orphan, it's suborphan or sub-suborphan diseases. And clearly these need to be addressed. They also need to be addressed when they're just, not cancers, but just other very rare diseases. All right, we'll put that aside for the moment. Even in kind of bigger, more well-known tumor types, there has been a hesitancy to pursue because of the perceived risk that in often cases is a real risk in these tumor types. So let's just take two, for example. Glioblastoma, very high unmet need, right?
Absolutely.
Very poor outcomes, Pancreatic cancer, another very high unmet need, even bigger epidemiology than glioblastoma. Also very high unmet need. Again, in all cases, these are generally diagnosed late. Certainly pancreatic cancer, most are diagnosed late. Good percentage are not resectable. What do you do? Well, one could say, well, there should be more clinical development there, and there should be. But there's a sizable
when we're faced with a patient, that's
yes. But there is a sizable amount of clinical development there, But part of the reason why maybe the amount is not as proportional to the unmet need, and I've done some mapping before and others have too, where you just kind of plot how many drugs are in development against either the epidemiology or against the actual unmet need. And unmet need is best expressed either as 1 or 5-year survival. It parallels pretty well, but there are some, kind of major places where there are gaps. But something like pancreatic or GBM, there have been a lot of drug failures. All sorts of different mechanisms, all sorts of things that people have done, and failure after failure. Now, I don't know that now we should go into the reasons for those. They're differing. First of all, GBM is very heterogeneous. It's not like one thing. So, a given target, while it may work for a certain percentage of patients, may not work for all. And since we may not know how to identify those patients up front, it means when you do a clinical trial, your signal is going to be drowned out. And so the drug may fail. And for pancreatic cancer, also the biology is complex because pancreatic cancer basically builds this dense fibrotic stroma around it. It makes it very hard for drugs of any sort to get to the cancer. So for those and other reasons, they're both highly, they have high kind of chemo resistance and other things. Just makes it really hard. So we've seen antibodies fail, small molecule kinase inhibitors fail, next generation chemo agents fail, cell therapies, vaccine. Time and again in both these indications, things have failed. And when things fail that much, it makes it hard to convince someone to fund doing research in those areas. Now, again, it's not like there's no research. There is a lot of clinical development in these areas, but perhaps not as much as there should be given their unmet needs because of that overhang of the failure rate in those tumor types. So that is where foundations can be helpful, right? So there are many foundations that have been started, often by either survivors or family members. They may have well-to-do, to begin with and can start the endowment, but, there are some great foundations out there in solid tumors, some of which are obviously well-known, like in breast cancer, Susan Komen, et cetera, and others in heme malignancies, like the Myeloma Research Foundation or Leukemia Lymphoma Foundation, et cetera. These are very helpful because part of their mandate, so I can speak more fluently to Leukemia Lymphoma Society, LLS, because we've worked with them for over a decade. Part of their mandate is to fund where biopharma does not. So go for the riskier things.
So they're filling the gap.
They're filling the gap. Yep. So that's what the foundations can do, is fill the gap, either by the tumor types that aren't getting as much attention as they should, or the therapeutic approaches that, maybe they're more swing for the fences. They're very high risk. That's not where VCs may want to fund or pharma wants to go. But if they were to work, they could be, groundbreaking.
Yeah.
So.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Sure.
It's a question that comes up and, it goes through your mind often. Like, I wish I would want to help this person, but what tools are there? What tools are available?
Yeah.
So you work with so many biotechs as a consultant. What trends are you seeing in?
Yes. So one of the, it may not be the best metric, but it's a very tangible metric that one can use is you can look at pipeline activity, right? So where is the clinical development pipeline? And you can also look at deals, and you can look at funding, VC
Where's
funding.
the money going?
Either seed funding or Series A funding, like where's the money going? Either funding money or deal making money. That includes licensing and acquisition. So, over the past, 7+ years, there are really kind of two big categories where investment has gone. Investment, startups, deal making, et cetera. It's precision oncology, right? These are targeted agents going to specific molecular changes, right? EGFR mutations, ALK mutations, FGFR mutations, BCR, ABL mutations. So whether these are solid tumor, because that's a very defined molecular target. You can define the patient population. You have a much higher rate of response because you're really defining who should get a given drug. And you actually have a much better clinical development chance, right? Because as I gave in the kind of the counter example, negative example for GBM or pancreatic, you may not necessarily know who's going to be responsive. And so your signal of those who are responsive may be washed out in the trial, will read out negative. So that type of precision medicine, and we just literally had approval a few days ago from Amgen for their RAS targeting agent. RAS had been like the big struggle for the biopharma industry for decades, right? They just couldn't drug it. And finally, people found that there were some particular mutations within RAS that could be drugged. So now we have the first RAS drug from Amgen that got approved just, days or maybe a week ago. So precision oncology and then immuno-oncology. I mean, immuno-oncology for a period of time, say from like 2014, 15 through about 2018, was like probably 2/3 of the highest value deals that were being done, meaning either the money upfront that a pharma was going to pay to a biotech or the overall value of the deal. So including downstream payments, milestones, and et cetera. It's kind of equalized a bit over the past few years with kind of more of the precision medicine, taking, so it's more balanced, more like kind of 50-50 for these high profile deals. And it probably is true overall. But even in the most recent analysis we've done for this past, the year to date or 2020 to year to date, looks like, again, kind of a lot more of a push towards the immuno-oncology agents again. I mean, people are very enamored of that and with good cause because, tumors are very complex. They're plastic, they're heterogeneous, they change under treatment, right? There are little Darwinian experiments going on. So the minute you treat them, that tumor is going to respond and counteract what you're treating it with. So it's very hard if you have, one agent or even a toolkit of 10 agents to say, I'm going to go against this foe that constantly keeps changing when I do something. The immune system is built for that. The immune system is plastic, adaptive, heterogeneous, can change in real time, just like the tumor. So in many ways, it is the best matched to deal with a cancer. And I think in part, that's why, that's the kind of the biologic and clinical rationale for why people are and should be so interested in kind of harnessing the immune system. I think the very practical reason is, Keytruda is going to be the largest selling pharmaceutical product in a few years of any, not just in oncology, period. Oh, wow. So, this is a very big category. And you said it before, chasing the money. Where the money is, people will go and they'll keep going and they'll go again and again. So,
sounds like it checks off all the boxes.
Yes. The checkpoints in particular check off the boxes.
So, you have vast experience. So you might be the best person to answer this question. What are your predictions for the future of oncology pharmaceutical therapy development? I know we've gone over a couple things. So what do you think is the next frontier?
So the next frontier, there are lots of famous quotes about predictions being mostly wrong, but nevertheless, I think the prediction that I'm going to make is less about what will definitively become the drugs of the future, but more about the types of approaches that I think are going to be heavily invested on and focused in over the coming, 5 to 10 plus years. And I think it's the idea of more engineering of biology to make the therapies we use more multifunctional and perhaps more regulatable or controllable in the body. So whether it's a antibody that can be controlled externally, and what does that mean? Well, that means that if you've got side effects with a certain antibody and you build in something that allows it to be active in one configuration, but when you give a drug, it's no longer active, right? You could give a small molecule drug or the other way around. So you turn it on and off. And the same thing's being done with cell therapies. So this idea of conditionally active and controllable, as well as targeting multiple things, right? Because we just talked about how plastic and diverse and heterogeneous the tumors are. So, if you know you need to target HER2 and ultimately kind of 3 other key targets that become important when you modulate HER2 and the tumor tries to escape. Yeah. If you can hit HER2 and all those other targets at the same time, wouldn't that be pretty cool?
Absolutely.
So people are looking at ways to do that. You can do that with gene editing or things that are kind of like gene therapy. You can do it with certain types of cell therapy. You can do it with RNA-based therapeutics. You can do it with certain multifunctional antibody or antibody-like molecules. Then you can build in that regulatory, the regulation that I talked about, being able to kind of control that so you have better quality of life and safety for the patients. And so, that kind of more complex or more refined engineering or bioengineering is, I think, where a lot of things are going. It's going to take a while to get there. But, ultimately, whether that means we're talking about some mini type of robot. There was an interesting kind of counterpoint at a conference that I attend called and speak at called IO360 every February here in Manhattan. And that was one of the interesting kind of counterpoints between two kind of luminaries in the oncology field, was kind of where the future is, and this idea of kind of robots. Now that doesn't mean they're little miniature silicon-based things that are, but the idea of robot being something that is responsive, that can do multiple things, that can change in reaction to changing environment. That's what's kind of meant, and that's what I'm meaning with this more complex and interesting engineering.
That is so exciting to be able to control.
Sci-fi, but there are people working on it right now. Some of these are starting in the clinic right now too. So.
Absolutely. Wow, that's so exciting. So you said it's already starting.
Some of them are already going into the clinic. The early generations of these things. Yeah.
The first steps.
Yeah.
The first steps, but soon maybe we'll get to.
I hope. Yeah.
The nanobots.
Well, and there, that's one thing too. So going back to that question of kind of why are certain cancers, do they not have as many new drugs or powerful drugs, et cetera? Again, it's not for lack of trying. Like a third, roughly, of the overall biopharmaceutical pipeline. So wherever that's coming from, wherever in the world, or biotech or pharma or whoever, a third of that pipeline is cancer. That's a lot. That's a lot of drugs. That's like 5,000, 6,000, maybe more drugs of all sorts that are being looked at to try and treat, sometimes a very specific singular subset of one particular type of cancer, and sometimes, trying to go after every cancer. It's a very broad acting agent like Keytruda. So again, it's not for lack of trying. It may not always be the right approach. It may not always be the smartest approach, because, lots of other things complicate decision making. It's not just a purely rational process.
So perhaps not lack of effort, but lack of success.
Yes. And sometimes lack of focus, or sometimes getting trapped within a certain mindset, right? Like the immune system will never work. Yeah, immune agents will never work. Right.
That's if we had to stop there.
Right. Getting away from dogma, is something that is harder than you should think in science, but
maybe that's a broader conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
Jeff, this has been a really great conversation and discussion. If any of our listeners want to reach out to you with any follow-up questions or just want to reach out to you at all, what's the best way for them to do that?
So there's two ways. The way that most likely I would see easily and not accidentally miss would be like reaching out via LinkedIn, right? So LinkedIn connection and messaging. They can also find my email if they go to Cello Health BioConsulting.com to the website and go to the, who we are and the bios. And I think the emails for everyone are there. It's just that I get so many emails that there is the chance that if I don't recognize an email coming from someone I don't know, either the spam system will block it or I just won't see it because I get so many emails. So
it will disappear into the ether. Yeah. I've had those. So I will add the links to your LinkedIn and also the Cello website here in the show notes for anyone who would like to follow up. Again, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Alicia, thank you. It's been great talking with you.
Have a great day.
Take care, you too. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Working in Oncology. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to leave a quick rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.